Terrific meeting. I want to thank everyone for coming and for your participation. It's been incredibly illuminating. And it was nice for me to see Susan Menares, but I was disturbed that she came back from the West Coast infectious, as she said, because she spent Friday sitting next to me at UCSF. So who knows what's in store for me. So I think this has been a terrific meeting, and one of the, I think, powerful things about it is that we started the morning sort of getting a little bit of ground state, kind of looking to see where we really are. And when you think back at what we heard from Rob Califf, he took a rather dark view on where we are, 34th in health outcomes, and that still dropping. And the inability of the FDA to be able to both go fast enough and to really have representative trials that expand the diversity of our country, that enable them to make really clear conclusions about the safety and efficacy of a given drug candidate across our whole population. It reminded me a little bit of what Peggy Hamburg, former commissioner of the FDA, used to say about the FDA, which is that it moves at two speeds, too fast and too slow. That was pretty illuminating. So we heard that from Rob, and then from Alondra, she used the recent National Science Board report showing the kind of incredible change in the relative expenditure for research and development between the private sector, the for-profit private sector, and the government over the decades. And the fact that she used that as one way to exemplify the fact that the government had sort of given up its priority in governance of our system. There are other ways as well, but I thought that was a dramatic example of that. And so I think that, in a way, what we're trying to do is to think hard about how to recover those things, do things that really do act equitably in ways that we do research, develop therapies and cures, hopefully, and do so in a way that benefits all. It's a huge challenge, and I think that our kind of the ground state that we benefited from in those opening talks helped to establish that. One of the things that wasn't said, but for those of you who read the report, have been reminded of, is that when the committee started our work, we looked at 30-something, Katie, I don't remember the number, but 35 recent technology developments, to sort of interrogate them and ask, where was it along the technology innovation pathway that matters of ethics and equity came into play, were considered? And the disturbing finding was essentially never. I think we found one where it was rather prominently considered, but it was only because after this technology reached the market, problems were discovered. And so we had to kind of backtrack and get it fixed. So that's the ground state. We have a long way to go. The challenges are substantial, and moving forward is complex. In the last session, we considered funding and oversight mechanisms to try to move us in that direction. And now in this session, we're going to, and that was really recommendation one, was to have the government, OSTP and specifically, establish a strategy that would really examine and consider ethics and equity along this entire pathway. And so to do it in a way that would sort of recover this oversight capacity of the government to do that, and to bring the rest of the community into play as it did that. So in this session, what we'll do is to consider what could be viewed as an even more challenging notion, which is to create a culture of equitable innovation. Culture creation, as you know, across a problem like this that's multi-sector, means changing the values and beliefs and behaviors of multiple groups of people who come at a problem from different directions, not uncommonly with different motivations and drivers, and get them to kind of align, to get them into this and onto the same track with some of the same motivations. So culture change is hard. As somebody said earlier, that culture eats policy for lunch. So how do we really immerse equity principles into the culture of biomedical research and technology development? That's the challenge before us with this group of panelists. The panel represents three stakeholder domains: academia, and there's two of each. Academia, Noah's Ark, the for-profit private sector, and the science and medicine publishing and commentary enterprise. So we will consider their current and potential roles and actions in creating or promoting a culture of equitable innovation, and perhaps look at some of the complexities or barriers or limits to being able to get there, and maybe push our panelists to talk about what the future priorities are that can really move our enterprise in the right directions. Perhaps collaborative opportunities across this space or across the sectors that were represented in the last round of government and the nonprofit private sector. So that's the challenge in front of us. Let me spend a moment introducing you to our panelists, and then we'll start to quiz them, cause trouble with them. Santa Ono is a president of the University of Michigan, previously served as president of the University of British Columbia and the University of Cincinnati. He's also an experienced vision researcher. Paula Hammond on screen is Institute Professor and Vice Provost at MIT. She is a distinguished researcher in MIT's Koch Institute for Integrative Cancer Research and former head of the Department of Chemical Engineering. Patricia Doikos, or Patty, is Bristol-Myers Squibb's inaugural Executive Director of Health Equity and the Executive Director of Global Health Equity at BMS. She has a long history in corporate philanthropy and social responsibility, and currently chairs the board, among other things that she's doing extramurally, chairs the board of the Center for Global Health Equity at the Dartmouth Medical School. Chris Fiebacher, welcome, Chris, just landed. Good to see you. Is the president and CEO of Biogen. He has previously led GlaxoSmithKline and Sanofi, and as well as several entrepreneurial biotech companies. Holden Thorpe is the editor-in-chief of the Science family of journals, and a professor of chemistry at the George Washington University. Previously, he served as provost at Washington University, St. Louis, and chancellor at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And Eric Rubin is editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine and the NEJM journal group. He is also an immunology and infectious disease researcher at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. Terrific board, distinguished group, several of them either active or former researchers, so kind of spanning, some of them are spanning a couple of these domains that are of great importance to our discussion. So let me start with a question for each of you to sort of set the stage and and allow the audience to hear a little bit about what you're kind of doing and thinking about in this space. So what do you see as the essential elements in fostering a culture in health and medicine that considers the implications, of emerging technologies, including equity? And Paula, since the on-screen people always get the short shrift, I'm going to start with you.
All right, thank you, Keith. And I'm coming from a university setting, and I think it's interesting because at universities we don't have as many sticks. We have primarily the ability to persuade the members of our organization to engage in what we think is important. I think some of the elements that have been really important from my perspective include the presence of diverse groups, having research labs, having graduate students and faculty who represent our nation, represent minoritized groups, represent groups over a range of incomes and experiences. That actually leads to conversations and discussions on every level. And I think that impacts everything from what kinds of problems get selected, which I think is key, to the approaches that are advocated. So to a large extent, having the numbers is really important. And this is one of the challenges that we face, especially I'm coming from an engineering background, especially in the STEM fields, trying to keep those numbers up through graduate and faculty levels. And the other element that we need is the ability to establish a way to recognize and value what those various perspectives bring, and encouraging an interchange among our different members of the community that can lead to new and innovative approaches. So I'll stop there because I know you have a number of perspectives to get, but in my view, those are the key components.
Great, thank you. Chris, we'll just come right down the line here.
Health equity is there we go. I mean, health equity is something that affects us all the time within the biopharmaceutical industry. I started with GlaxoSmithKline when we launched AZT for HIV as the first medicine. I found myself as the general manager of France, working with the Minister of Health for France, Bernard Kouchner, who was also a founder of Médecins Sans Frontières. And I found myself a few years after that riding in a Jeep 4 hours north of Kampala with Tony Fauci, looking at how the PEPFAR program had impacted HIV in Africa. And a few years after that, I found myself co-chairing with Bill Gates the Roundtable on Neglected Diseases. And you learn a few lessons along the way, and I think one of the things is that health equity is a lot more than just access to treatment. You really have to think about the whole ecosystem. I remember the critics of PEPFAR, for example, saying, well, we can't just provide all these tablets for HIV because they're complicated. You have to take them at certain times of the day, and people in Africa don't wear watches. So how can they tell the time? But I can tell you they can tell the time. And we actually ended up getting involved with education, with the access. We had to actually create almost a whole global unwritten accord about how to price in the developing world versus the developed world. So I think it becomes a mindset within your organization. And I do agree with Paula that you also first have to have diversity within your own organization. I think Biogen has really made a lot of strides in that. I've only been at Biogen 18 months, so I take zero credit for that. But you do have to understand the circumstances of people you're trying to help. This is not just an economic problem. There's culture, there's structure, infrastructure. On vaccines, we had to solve the last mile problem. Could you actually keep vaccines out in 50 degrees centigrade heat, for example? So it's really trying to solve all those problems, but it becomes an organizational culture issue.
Yeah, I agree. I think that you can't expect the product of research to be equitable if the system that produces it isn't equitable. And right now we're doing basically a terrible job of that. We don't have good representation among faculty. The institutions are bogged down with their bureaucracy and can't respond to things. We are mistreating graduate students who want to get out of science and do things that are science adjacent. I got an email this morning from a woman of color at an excellent academic medical center who had come to a AAAS meeting for graduate students who wanted to go into science policy and science communication and stuff. And when she went back to her group and talked about it, her PI made fun of her for coming to the meeting and not working in the lab in front of her whole lab. So, you know, as long as stuff like that is going on, and look, it's pervasive. I told this story at a different talk an hour ago, and the head of Thomas Jefferson Medical School said, yeah, this is pervasive. So if it's pervasive that we're going to ridicule people for doing things outside the laboratory, which is what you need in order to achieve this, then guess what? We're not going to achieve it. And a lot of these people are in the National Academy who pull this stuff. So I would challenge Victor and Marcia and John to make it a priority that we should want our graduate students to do what they want, not what we think they should do. And if we could change that, that would have a huge impact right there, and that's something we control.
Just building on everything that was said, you know, at BMS, we too, like GSK and other companies, have the benefit of having worked in HIV, which gives us many of the lessons in the playbook of how to comprehensively and disruptively address health disparities and bring innovation along for it. As the advocate said, as we were discussing before, you know, the advocates really said, you're going to be doing everything differently. You're going to research differently, you're going to create access differently, approvals are going to be different, phase 4 studies are going to be different, how you price and flex all the different levers you have to create access is going to be different, and will help you arrive at those answers. So at BMS, we really think about how are we going to move our organization to really not just speak to equity as an important value that we have, but activate it along the life cycle. So not only in terms of inclusive research and diversity in clinical trials, and it does help those teams that the FDA works to say, this is what we expect from you, let's work on these diversity plans together. But nobody really asks the commercial organization, how are you doing across different populations? So we're really looking to bring into our commercial teams this mindset of, you know, who is this all for? Who has it been for so far, and how can we do better? If you walk into the Bristol-Myers Squibb site, any of them, there are banners everywhere that help us to remind ourselves why we're there, and says, who are you working for? And so our health equity question back is, who aren't we working for yet? How will we see those patients and communities? And then how will we evolve our regular research and business practices and processes to arrive at a different place in terms of the reach and utilization of these incredible medical innovations, so that we can join up this moment of incredible science and chance to develop new tools, and again, who's it all for? The populations that are affected, and bring those together every step of the way throughout the life cycle. And then also through external partnerships. Fortunately, none of us have to do this alone. So how can we collaborate differently? I mean, part of the way that I was able to create my position was just showing our leadership. You can do what you want, but every stakeholder that matters to Bristol-Myers Squibb, CMS, every medical society setting guidelines, major health systems, ministry, they all have health equity officers who are driving equitable access to the goods and services that they provide. So we need to move with that, and we need to add our special pieces to these collaborative efforts that we can create together, like today. So thank you.
So let me just follow up on that for a moment, Patty. So in the last panel, the academic tech transfer offices got beat up pretty soundly for simply being driven by revenue. You and Chris represent the for-profit private sector. And so, a lot of people would say that you're driven by revenue. How are you building this kind of culture of inclusiveness and equity within that, under that tent? And is that really something that is unique to your company or your companies, or are we really moving in the right direction without at least my really being aware that this is a real shift in the way that the for-profit sector is operating? That certainly makes me optimistic to hear it, if that's the case.
So just a few things. I mean, when we look at health equity, we think of the patient case, the science case, the business case, and better performance against our mission case as well. So I think what's starting to happen is that our teams are, especially commercial teams, are, again, really looking deeply at the question of who have we reached so far, where have we created the opportunity to benefit from medical innovation, and then where does that drop-off happen? And how can we push more deeply into those populations? And with that is also business left on the table as well. So we're creating it as a shared value proposition where it's the right thing to do, and it's also a good thing to do, both for, of course, patients benefiting from the medical innovations, the outcomes that ensue, and also for the business so we can continue to invest in innovations going forward.
Chris, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I go back to, you can't just start with health equity. I think it has to be a broader theme. One of the things that really amazed me when I got to Biogen is this embrace of diversity. The Biogen employees are super proud of this. 30% of director and above are representatives of ethnic or racial minorities. 48% of all director and above position are women. In fact, our executive committee is 5 women, 4 men. And so it's part of the ethos of the company. And I think it is because people of diverse origins have been made to feel comfortable and welcome and successful in the organization. Now, what gets measured gets done in organizations. So we actually have a global scorecard that determines the incentive compensation arrangements. We have, for instance, a metric that 90% of all phase 3 clinical trials have to have recruitment that represent the underlying epidemiology, which actually in cases like Alzheimer's or lupus means that you have to have an even higher percentage of people, for instance, with African American origin. We also are following the lead of BMS, where we've actually just hired and appointed a head of health equity because you need someone that is thinking about that on a day-to-day basis. Then you have to think about, well, what are some of the barriers? One of them is certainly distance. So we actually have worked with an organization that has mobile research units because sometimes it's difficult for people to access clinical trial sites. Doing this in multiple languages. There's a huge issue of mistrust of the healthcare organization in clinical trials as a result of heinous acts that were committed decades ago. And so we're working with faith-based organizations and other organizations that can help create that trust. You have to think culturally. I mean, one of the things I discovered early on is that in the Hispanic population, for example, the pharmacist is a more important caregiver than the physician. And so thinking about where do people go for healthcare advice, I think we can do better as an industry. I think we have to do a lot more that's virtual care. And we're going to have to work with the FDA on this. I think we could do a lot more with remote sensing and monitoring, for example, with patients. We have done a number of seminars of education. We have done them for lupus, Parkinson's, and Alzheimer's. We did something like 35 sessions with 700 participants, but we had 350,000 participants virtually. And we have seen an increase in clinical trial participation after that. And then I think we work with partners. We've done things. 2 weeks ago, I was at the Boston Center for Healthcare for the Homeless, which is an organization that we have funded, but it's just amazing that it was started by a physician out of Harvard in 1985 who is actually still there. I've worked with a number of colleagues in North Carolina. We've created an Ingram Institute at an institute you know well, Holden, at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, to create an Ingram Center dedicated to rural health and thinking about how do we find new economic models, healthcare models, and actually also help train healthcare professionals that are willing to work in that environment. So there is no one silver bullet to this, but I think we can do things together in an industry, and I would say as a member of the board of pharma that there is actually an industry effort also, so that it's not just BMS and Biogen doing this. This is a commitment on the part of the whole industry.
Great, great. Okay, let me move back to marching down the row here. Eric.
It's tough to go to fifth and think of something novel to say. The only saving grace is I'm not Santa. I think that we look at issues of equity in two ways. One is looking inward, and it reflects everything that people have been saying before. If we're not diverse in our room, in the room where we're reviewing manuscripts, then we don't have the same conversations that we'd have, and we don't have bring the same values to the table as we would otherwise. So diversifying our own ranks, and that means diversifying in terms of race and ethnicity, but also intellectually diversifying, I think is a very important part when we evaluate things that are going to have impacts on health in various communities. And then there's the outward part. And unlike Paula, we have both carrots and sticks. The carrot is we can accept an article, and the stick is we cannot accept the article. And that gives us, some sort of power over what comes in the door. What we can't control is what happens before it comes in the door. And reflecting on what Holden said, the whole ecosystem has to change in order to change what we receive as manuscripts coming in the door. We have tweaks around that, and maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later, that we can do to try to steer it that way. But in fact, it's not that simple. The clinical trials world has a huge number of players, all of whom have their own interests. And equity isn't always a big part of that. So I think that there's a lot of work to do.
Great. So Santa.
So I'm number 6?
Yeah, you're number 6.
I'll try to say something unique. I would say that our approach at the University of Michigan at looking at making sure equity is part of healthcare innovation is first, as I think was said by Paula, just to focus on diversity at the high level and ensuring that we talk about it all the time. And so we're undergoing something called a culture journey at the University of Michigan, where we have a pretty much enterprise-wide effort to talk about the importance of diversity and talk about equity and what it means. But that's a very high level. I think the most effective way that we can ensure that equity is a consideration in biomedical innovation is by investing in platforms that make it clear that it's a priority for the university. So I'm going to just talk about a couple of those things and talk about some steps that we've taken in terms of the bureaucracy to eliminate that as a barrier. So the first is that we have about 8,000 faculty members at the University of Michigan. About 700 of them are focused on healthcare inequities, either nationally or internationally. One of them is led by John Ianian, who leads our Healthcare Policy and Innovation Institute, which has about 650 faculty members associated, focusing just on data mining to look at impact of differences in policy, payment, practices, innovation on patient health across a whole wide range of diseases, and many of you know his work in diabetes, cancer, heart disease, mental health, children's health, and hospital care. So that's what we're doing on a national level. But there's a similar investment over the past 4 years in a large initiative funded by Tachi Yamada's family, which is looking formerly of GSK and Takeda and Gates, focusing on global health inequities. And that institute now has 100 faculty members. So we have about 750 of our 8,000 faculty that are focused on health innovation with a focus on inequities. And so that is the platform, the data upon which we can interdigitate innovation from the other 19 schools of the university, the Life Sciences Institute, drug discovery, rational drug design, to really focus like a laser beam on opportunities to address health inequities based upon the data that comes from mining the healthcare information we have. The last thing I'm going to say is that we talked about tech transfer and that was being beat up. We recognize that that's a barrier. And so one thing we did 2 years ago is to switch it from being a tech transfer office traditionally defined, assessed by revenue, and then create different parts of the office where individuals are focused just on not measuring revenue, but on social impact. And we've changed the name of the office to Innovation Partnerships, where particular individuals are focused not on the bottom line, but on, for example, addressing orphan diseases and drugs and having an impact on some of the inequities that we find from both our international and national platforms.
So let me pursue that for a second. In addition to the tech transfer offices in academia getting beat up in the last session, Holden took off on academia in general for the kind of way, in a way, the values that we espouse to students in making clear to them where the reward structures are and the ways that they behave. And that certainly extends to our promotion and tenure and hiring practices. So are the things that you talked about really then reflected in the recognition and reward structures following on in people's careers?
Well, I would say there's a favorite example. There are a couple, but I'm going to just choose one. And we have a long-standing medical science training program at the University of Michigan. I don't know if you're familiar with it, over a decade old, where we actually pay for the preclinical training of individuals that are not from North America. So they'll get an MBBS or they'll get another medical degree from another country where they really need our support. And then we bring them to the University of Michigan for the clinical training, or for basic science training or their postdoctoral training. And the way we ensure that they give back and not just stay is the expectation is that they'll go back, say, if they come from Africa. So, that's a clear commitment by the institution to reward individuals that come to the university wanting to be trained in science and clinical medicine, motivated, and we select them because they actually want to address the inequities. And they go back. And they're trained by us, they're funded by us, and they directly address health inequities in other parts of the world.
Well, let me just say this about tech transfer, because I've worked on this problem longer than any other one. When I came to science, someone who's amazingly wonderful, Val DeVinson, was basically teaching me what my job was. She's our executive editor. And she gave me a great analogy because I grew up in the theater, and she said, look, we work backstage. The authors are on stage. We're backstage. We make sure their data is posted to Zenodo and that they're disclosing all their code, and we go through the citations and make sure they're correct and help them get their papers reviewed so they can be accurate. And, when the papers are covered in the New York Times, the journal I don't comment on the paper, the authors do, and we have a whole team, and Eric does too, that sets people up to do that. So with tech transfer, it's the same problem. The tech transfer officers, because of Autumn and because of a lot of things that has developed in their culture, have mistakenly come to believe that they work on stage, not backstage. If they realized that they work backstage and that the inventors and the authors and the PIs and the students were the ones on stage, then I think a lot of this problem would go away. But I tell you, every time I've fixed it, and I fixed it at UNC, and then I fixed it again at WashU, every time I left, the weeds grew right back. It's kudzu. And I don't know what to do about it.
I hope there's no one from tech transfer here. I know.
No, listen, there's a dartboard with my picture on it at every autumn meeting, because they know, I put in all these boilerplate agreements and all this stuff. And listen, a lot of the people that I've gone to about this, both places, have said, oh, good, now you've told me what my job is. And, there are some people who leave who want to be the star of the deal, but there are a lot of people who want to work backstage. And, those people are really happy when you make this adjustment. It's just that there's so much gravitational pull elsewhere in the system that it's just very hard to sustain that if there's not somebody sitting on them all the time.
So I wonder, Holden, you and Eric, in principle, sorry? Oh, Paula, sorry, go ahead. All right.
I'm sorry, Keith.
No.
Want to comment on the tech transfer issue and something I think that is not unrelated. First of all, I think I'm fortunate because MIT does have a very strong tech transfer office and system, which tends to encourage rather than discourage the movement of IP. But I will say that an area that we've started to look at more closely is who's doing the founding of companies within our university. And I think that's another part of the equation. And I'll credit the work of Susan Hochfeld, Sangeeta Bhatia, and Nancy Hopkins as part of this biotech working group that we've had in the Boston area. They actually did a study of the number of founders who are represented at our institution. And at MIT, 40% of our male professors, for example, have founded at least one company, where the number is about half that, 22% for women. This is one example of a gender difference. I imagine that there are other differences that are present among minoritized groups as well. And one of the things that Sangeeta Bhatia has done to try to address that is essentially create a Future Founders Initiative in which women faculty are able to submit proposals. They go through a kind of series of workshops that help them understand how to move their innovation forward in the biotech area. And then those biotech innovations are down selected in a competitive process, and some of them get funding to actually move that work to the next level. I think this is just one example, but I think that there are other opportunities that we have, especially as we begin to gain more diversity. We started with the idea that we need more presence and more participation. When we have our participation at the university level, we also have to make sure that we are supporting those members of the community who aren't always represented in the innovation process, and see if we can ensure they have the tools that they need to be able to succeed in transferring that technology, which is more than just the technology transfer office. Some of it is, does that PI even have the time to develop this new innovation while doing all the other things that they're doing? And I think that there are imbalances there with different groups coming from different backgrounds and perspectives. So I just wanted to raise that we need to bolster our innovation ecosystem so that we have equity there as well.
Terrific.
And also mentioned that serving on boards is a part of that as well. And we see the same kinds of differences in terms of who's on the boards of companies, especially biotech.
Thanks, Paula. I'm going to ask one more question of Holden and Eric, but before the session started, Katie grabbed me and said that there's a lot of pent-up energy out there for asking questions and making comments. So after that, we're just going to shift to the audience. I think it was just Katie's way of saying that your questions are much more interesting than mine. She's nice that way. So what I was going to ask Eric and Holden is that in principle, you as editors-in-chief could actually be an enforcer that says as papers come in that have the potential, or you consider maybe the imperative, to have equity considerations built in. You could essentially stop the papers at the door and say, this looks interesting, but show us how you've considered matters of equity, social justice, whatever, as you've done your study. Do you do any of that, and do you think that that's actually a role that the scientific publishers should play as considered gatekeeping? But what do you think about that?
Well, I think there's, the issues are slightly different for a clinical journal than for a largely basic science journal. For one thing, the trials often were designed long ago and funded long ago, and they're coming into us 7, 8 years after they were designed. And I think the sensitivity to equity issues wasn't as great there. And it's a little bit unfair to penalize people for the changing culture a little bit. Having said that, what we've done a couple of years ago is institute a requirement that every clinical trial adds a table in the supplement which talks about the disease. It's very specific. It talks about the disease and what that disease they're studying is, the distribution of that disease among the population, and then the distribution of their participants in the study, and then why is their participation different. And then we incorporate usually a sentence or two into the main text reflecting that this was representative of the disease or it wasn't. So for right now, that's largely shaming people. That's all it's doing. We're not often rejecting, but I will say that as an example, without anonymizing it a bit here, we had a study come in, I believe it was last year, that was of a disease that's very prevalent in Black Americans, and the study population was almost entirely white. And we rejected it on that basis, saying that's not, they're not testing the right population. But it's complicated. What if you do a study in Japan? Everyone's going to be Japanese, and that seems fair. And yet, it's not going to tell you anything about how an Hispanic American is going to do. So we kind of have to make allowances that, and it's not so simple.
Yeah, we're always coming up with new things we can do. I mean, we publish papers on archaeology and, various things that happen around the world. So the provenance of artifacts and the way that local populations are included, in those papers, we pay a lot of attention to all of that stuff, and we're always finding new things we hadn't thought of that we need to account for. I think the biggest thing that we're working on this is that we have a collaboration now with the researchers at the University of Colorado, and we're getting close enough to this being real that I'm comfortable talking about it. We are going to release an anonymized data set of 10 years of science and science advances with the reviews scored, with the genders and ethnicities of all of our editors and board members and reviewers and authors and the institutions that they came from. And, the academic collaborator that we're working with, he gets first crack at all this. So his analysis will come first, but he's done a ton of work to produce this data set. So we think that's a reasonable thing for him. But then the data are going to be up there, and anyone who wants to analyze it can analyze it. And I can already tell you, having looked at some of what's come out, it's not a great picture. It turns out if your paper is from a highly prestigious school, it rolls through pretty easily. And if it's further down, it might not ever have a chance of getting reviewed. And women are treated more harshly than men. And women reviewers, this of course makes sense. Women reviewers are much more skeptical than male reviewers. And there's all kinds of things you can learn in these data. And so within the next year or so, I would say we're going to be publishing this and putting it out there for anybody who wants to do research on it and publish on it. And chips will fall where they may. It won't be a pretty picture for the last 10 years of science, for sure. You'll be off the board by then, so somebody else will have to worry about that.
Keith, if I could follow up on that. First off, I come from one of those prestigious organizations, and I'm submitting something this year. I hope you take
I'm sure it'll do fine.
Yeah. I think it's, that's a really great illustration. We're doing something that's not quite the same, but we've been publishing, I think we've published 5 articles now on where we commissioned historians to look back at our old issues we've published for 200 years and look to see what sort of historical injustices our pages have propagated. It's not pretty. And I think, it's not just self-flagellation. I think that it's something going forward. I think if we don't take lessons from it's one thing to say, oh, all those people were bad. All of this happened before I was editor, so who cares? But I think if we don't take those lessons going forward, then we will have missed an opportunity.
Terrific. Great. Okay. Let's throw it open to lots of hands up. Sorry.
I'm very surprised because we are almost at the end of this. We have been talking about the cost of medications and the inability for people who don't have money to get these medications, and the fact that many of the newest medications are incredibly expensive. And nobody has mentioned the Bayh-Dole Act and the marching rights, which are actually a federal law. And I find fascinating that it's the only thing where big academia and drug companies found complete consensus. And yet it's the only real idea to drop the prices of the drugs at least a little bit, and disappeared. Nobody's talking about it. So anybody that has any idea where this discussion is, and why such a bad idea that the government says, look here, we want to charge a ridiculous amount of money, we're going to go with another company. Especially because that is all NIH-funded research. So if the idea is really the social importance and not money, why not do that? At least it's a different idea. It could be a nice trial.
Well, I'll be the designated piñata here. I think you have to distinguish a few things. One is, what do you need to do to have a successful research and innovation ecosystem? And then on the other side, you need to think about, affordable and equitable access to care. I spent a major chunk of my life in Europe. And in fact, when I started in Germany, Europe was spending 50% more on research and development than the US. And Germany was considered the pharmacy to the world. By 2000, I was on a panel with a working group with the European Commission. And we started looking at referenced patents as a surrogate for innovation. And it turns out 80% already by a year 2000 were filed in the US. And, where I live in Boston, Cambridge, and where Paula is, this is the most prolific biopharmaceutical research and development center anywhere in the world. And I think most other countries would love to have something like what we have. And the reason it works is that there is this collaborative approach. You got a lot of great science, for instance, in France, but it doesn't go anywhere. The translational element is missing. Here, if you look at Boston, Cambridge, between the fact that there's been historically lots of venture capital, you've got outstanding teaching hospitals, outstanding universities and medical schools, and then you've got a lot of the talent that actually transforms that. The reality is that most drugs do not come out of the NIH. And in fact, the NIH does not develop drugs. They can be very helpful in establishing some of the basic science that leads us to finding targets. I can remember AZT, I talked about earlier, went through a big patent fight with the NIH because Burroughs Wellcome at the time had taken an old cancer medicine, but they needed to have the specialized antiviral facilities of the NIH to actually test the drug. And at that point, it was believed, well, then the NIH actually had the intellectual property. And the NIH lost on that because just the fact that you provide facilities is not actually the intellectual input. Now, I firmly believe that the NIH is the crown jewel in all of this because the NIH actually establishes a level of scientific excellence in this country that doesn't really exist. If you go to equivalent organizations in Europe, what you're going to find is, well, we have to kind of spread the money around, make sure that this region gets it and that region gets it. You know, I'd recruited Elias Zahuni to be my head of research and development when I was CEO of Sanofi, and had to do a big project for the French government exactly on that topic and couldn't move it. Here, I wouldn't say the NIH is without politics, but it establishes a level of excellence. And then the ability to work with universities and create new treatments is extraordinary. And I think if you input Bayh-Dole, you're going to find that that whole ecosystem falls apart, because if that's where it's going to go, people will find other sources. Now, there is an issue of affordable and equitable access to healthcare. And so I would argue, don't touch something that is the best in the world to solve another problem, because I'm not even convinced that that would actually solve drug prices, to be honest. But it is a problem. Healthcare costs are higher in the United States than elsewhere. Drug prices are definitely higher, although I would tell you that when we see $1 spent on medicines in the United States, we get 48 cents. In Europe, our price might be 50% less, but I get 100% of that. And so we have created a system also with PBMs where we're now putting $150 to $200 billion of rebates into the system that are, you know, going to rebates to employers, that are going to state governments on Medicaid rebates, that are going to build bridges. But the actual list price of drugs gets pretty high, and that's what people are paying their copays on. I don't have a simple solution to that problem. What we try to do as an industry is work with organizations to help people cover their copays. Approximately 10 to 15% of most drug company medicines are going free of charge to patients who qualify. I think we are trying to get the price of medicines up in other countries. I can say as Biogen, we're in rare diseases and neurological conditions. We don't have the same level of price discrepancies, but you know, at the same time, you have to make drugs accessible. And the only way that you can control drug prices is to control access. So the only way we can actually try to get other countries to pay more is simply deny citizens access to those medicines. And that brings its own ethical challenges. As in an industry, you know, we have people in France who are French who want to make sure that French patients get drugs. And to be honest, we satisfice. We know that those patients need it. We're covering a lot of the fixed costs of research and development in the United States. That's not fair, but there isn't an easy answer to it. And I would suggest that we try to work together on trying to find solutions and not, you know, try to make one group the bad guy in all of this.
Is that related to what he was saying? Well, go ahead.
This is quick, but I think, look, I don't think the system will fall apart. I think, first of all, I'm not sure the federal government is going to execute the March-in very effectively. They've had March-in rights for 50 years, and they've never been able to do it. And the second is, even if they did, then the university inventor would just start a company and invent around their university IP, which happens most of the time anyway, because most of these drugs aren't the final composition of matter that you end up selling in the first place, because Chris can put way more medicinal chemists on the problem than you can in your lab. So I just think this is kind of I don't think this is going to have much impact. It's a great thing to talk about in policy circles in Washington.
So I just want a slightly different but overlapping, focusing on the question of how to build an equitable innovation ecosystem. You know, I think universities have a critical role to play because of the diversity of researchers and disciplines that are represented. You know, if you look at Gen AI, we were the first university to roll out Gen AI for the entire university community free of charge, and with the relationship with Microsoft and also with Google. I would say the reason why those companies want to work with us is because of the expertise that we have looking at every aspect of this new technology, this new innovation from a legal perspective, how it might be used for multiple sectors beyond the one it was originally intended for. So we're using that in the OR, we're using it in looking at urban planning, we're looking at it in how we teach and how we advise students. And so it produces a number of indications or uses for the new technology that they might not have expertise in, as large as they might be. But I think, the other example for why a university has to play a central role, especially a place like Michigan, is that you have schools that focus on health inequities, either national or global. And you can, if you're an administrator, bring those issues that are unsolved, that need attention, to an innovative machine which is hard to match in terms of breadth and depth. And so, for example, I'll give you two examples. One of the things that we've tried to address is early detection of preterm birth in Africa. It's not a major issue in terms of dollars, but in terms of social impact and social good, it's very, very important. And so just bringing that issue to our School of Engineering has resulted in innovations in ultrasound techniques that can actually identify preterm birth issues early and can save lives. The other is that in many parts of Africa, there's insufficient numbers of incubators to keep premature babies warm and so that they can thrive and survive. That's another issue that we can identify through our commitment to global health inequities, bring it to the engineers, and they create a completely new kind of substance, material, that keeps the temperature of the babies constant and enhances their ability to thrive. So universities not only have to identify and bring those problems to in-house innovation from our faculty and students, but also should fund that. I mean, if you're a university like the University of Michigan, with our endowment, we actually redirect some of our resources internally to fund that research, because it wouldn't be funded by a federal agency and may not be funded by the Gates Foundation, but still is something that needs attention and is for the social good. So the university can play a role by committing to being a place to build a culture of equitable innovation.
Other questions?
Okay, thank you. My name is Nicole Fody. I'm a sociologist and a postdoc at Johns Hopkins in the Bioethics Institute. My question is around, I guess, the culture of fast science that we're all kind of enmeshed in and how that impacts equity, right? In the private sector, we have, at least in Silicon Valley, it's move fast and break things, I think. And in academia, you see accelerating innovation, as quick as we can everywhere. And I'd like to hear, what you think about how we might shift culture in that realm.
If you look at some of the most exciting innovations that are around right now, like AI, I just came from Canada. And so if you look how it emerged from a relatively obscure set of investments by their equivalent of the NSF in Toronto and elsewhere, and you can see how that paid off. And so if you think about the recent Nobel Prize for the mRNA vaccine, one of the Nobel laureates had problems being promoted and getting tenure at Penn. It caused quite a fuss. And so these are examples where, and even if you look at the COVID vaccine and you look at the nanoparticle, that was published in the obscure journal, BBRC, I think. Peter didn't have an easy time getting funded because it wasn't in a high-profile journal. It was relatively slow, but it was fundamental to the synthesis of this new generation of vaccines that allowed us to respond to an unprecedented pandemic. So to hopefully answer your question, it's important for the scientific enterprise and everything that supports it, either at an institution or through funding agencies to fund that kind of slow science, because some of that is a seed corn for future innovation that's essential for new breakthroughs.
Yes, and I would echo what Santa said, which is that we really benefit from having a range of research opportunities, and universities are an excellent place to do that. We can have the basic research, we can have the critical sort of directional and more applied research, and we can get things to the point of clinical trial. And we need all of that range to be able to be a successful learning environment, because at the core, we are educational institutions where students are learning the skill sets as well as the modes of inquiry. And we need all of these different modes of inquiry at different points in the scientific trail. I think what is something that we can think about as a community is how we ensure that the funding for more fundamental science and even for some of our applied science can be directed in a way that enables new innovations. And I think that's something that has been a conversation, in part because in some cases you have to have a lot of the work already proven before you can get the grant funded. And I think if we enable a little bit more risk taking in proposals, then that will allow those new innovations that take time to develop and evolve to thrive more readily. So I think that there's a couple of elements in your question. One of them is, are we providing an innovative environment where slow science can thrive? And I think that universities are the place where that should happen, and we do try to support that. And I think our tenure and promotion cases can be based on a number of elements beyond translation. I do think that as we look at the way that reviewing and evaluating our science when it comes to proposals for these riskier kinds of scientific directions are working, there may be some ways in which we can tweak our environment so that more of them get funded and there's more opportunity for that basic slow science to go in those new directions that lead to big innovations.
Sorry, maybe I could just clarify a little. I think I used a term that means something that I didn't necessarily know exactly what it meant, so I apologize. But I was thinking, I was thinking back to our conversations about, public participation, community engagement, things that take a lot of time, and including diverse scientists and representatives and that kind of thing, like the kind of things that take quite a bit more time than just, Hopkins just hired or is about to hire 100 new faculty for AI and did these kinds of equity considerations.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I'm getting a lot of hope from the fact that indigenous science is getting to be something that is getting recognized. We gave the Newcomb Cleveland Prize for the best paper last year to a paper that was a collaboration between Western geneticists and archaeologists and many, many scientists from the Lakota tribe. And what they were able to do is to show that horses had migrated north much earlier in the history of the United States than was believed. And, it was the Western idea, of course, that only Westerners brought horses anywhere they went. So the Western legend was that the Spanish brought horses to the north and they didn't go to the south, and they didn't go to the north until the English brought them. Apparently they thought horses could only move east and west, I guess. I don't quite understand why. But anyway, the Lakota knew from their traditions that they had been interacting with horses for hundreds and hundreds of years. And then when they interacted with the Western scientists, they were able to show this in a way that Western science had never produced. And of course, there are a lot of these stories now building up, and we're starting to publish a lot more about this. And I've started interacting with these folks and, trying to figure out how we can do more to bring their story forward. And it's pretty interesting, some of the stuff that, like, they won't work with you unless you get into the of what they're doing, which includes things like, to them, truth isn't just saying that things that are true, it's also not leaving out things that you know. Right, and so when you're drafting a paper, this can be very complicated, and it's also they say things, they speak for 1 million Lakota, and they have these processes for how they can get 1 million people behind various things. Well, we, for example, our news department wrote a news story about the paper that was also in Science. Of course, we deal with this problem all the time. But the 1 million Lakota didn't get to approve the news story, and that created a whole problem. But if you look at what's underneath what they're saying, they're able to find things that reductionism just can't find. And, that's something we should be excited about learning. But, going back to the culture of American science, I get all these letters saying, there's no such thing as indigenous science, and why do you keep publishing all this stuff? Science is science. It speaks for itself. It doesn't matter who does it. And as long as all that crap is in our culture, then that's going to really hinder this kind of thing from coming forward.
I just want to weigh in this conversation because it's really a great question. Because if you look at the beginning of the day, Rob Califf said, we spend most money in the world in R&D, and we are 34th in outcomes. Our life expectancy is dropping, if not flattened. And the question is what's missing, right? So a lot of this discussion is about tech transfer, discovery, new innovation. But in fact, I think we're missing the last mile, right? If you think about what really is the issue, and thank you, Chris, for thinking about equity, school, or whatever, is the fact that we need to get more social science into it. We need to look more implementation science, addressing these are not fast ones, as you said. These are slow ones. But while we have just amazing innovation technology, we're not getting to people who need them. And it's not only delivery, it's actually social policies, it's in fact all the stuff we talked about today. So, Holden, I agree with you. That kind of science needs to be highlighted. In fact, in the, Keith, you're part of this, that Al Reese is writing this report on state of biomedical science US from NAM. And I think, and Gil Oman and I talked about this, what we're missing is highlighting some areas of science that need to be emphasized going forward. While we do so well in so many things, we need to invest heavily into social science, behavioral science, economic science, population health, things like that, which is also part of science. And that's how we can fill the last gap, the last mile, where in fact our great innovation can make a huge difference.
Yeah, I agree. I just wanted to point out that Holden has the ultimate slow science with like several thousand years went into that experiment. But I absolutely agree. And I think it's a broader value question. It's not simply to say we need a sociologist as part of a study. Right now, what do we value? The question of drug prices, we're willing to pay millions of dollars for gene therapies, hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars for CAR T cells, and for many oncology drugs. And we're serving a very small part of the population there. And yet we're not providing primary care to many segments of the population. And we're not paying for it. So it's a question of what we choose to pay for as a society. So this is a larger societal question, part of which can be addressed by incorporating, by making sure that we're incorporating many viewpoints into the science we're doing. But someone's got to pay for it, and we've got to make those decisions as to how we're going to allocate our money.
So I just want to actually answer your question, because you said we're not talking about hiring 100 faculty members focusing on AI. At the University of Michigan, funded by the NIH, we're actually hiring 40 new faculty focused just on this issue. Funded by the NIH, they're not just immunologists or molecular biologists. They're across a whole swath of disciplines focused on cultural transformation in medicine. And part of the money, it's about $80 million, is from the NIH. Some of it is from the University of Michigan, because we see exactly what you're saying. We have to hire the right kind of people to address the issue. So thank you for your question.
Just a last thing I'd offer is that it's also about having an infrastructure for inclusive innovation that is community-oriented, and we've seen a lot of movement over the last several years towards community-oriented clinical trials, which is not only about where are they cited, and BMS made a commitment to cite 25% of our sites in highly diverse communities. We're already at 58% now, but if you build it, there's other things that need to happen in the social science area to make people come, in terms of the community engagement that you're referring to. Also helping the investigators themselves to be upskilled in serving and working with patients in clinical trials who are diverse and from different kinds of backgrounds. What is in the clinical trials for the community, and so on. So, and the industry, I think, is making quite a contribution to help build out a national community clinical trial network and presence, and we certainly need to do more with others on that front. But that infrastructure is really, I think, important as well going forward.
Yeah, I want to just follow up from Victor's comment. 75% of the healthcare costs are driven really by chronic diseases, and a lot of those can be treated by generic drugs. 9 out of 10 prescriptions are for generic drugs. So the innovative part of the market is big in value, but not in volume. And yet, heart disease is still, I think, the biggest cause of mortality in this country. And even though you can get Lipitor or a generic of atorvastatin now for $4 at Walmart, it doesn't necessarily mean that people are actually understanding what they have to do for their cholesterol or for their blood pressure or for their diabetes. That was one of the thoughts behind the Ingram Institute, is how do we get some of those learnings? So, because a lot of it is going to be education. We do have a shortage of primary care, but I think, if we could do more virtual care, nurse practitioners, just outreach through different community groups, we could already do an awful lot on just basic health care. Because even where it's the health care is affordable doesn't necessarily mean it's accessible or even used. And there, I think, to the point of social sciences and how do we understand that? We're all focused on innovation for sure, and quality standards in our hospitals, but out in particular in rural communities where we're not all living next door to Massachusetts General Hospital, that's not even that easy. And certainly even in neighborhoods of Boston, I'm sure that we're going to find people that don't get the affordable drugs they need.
Yeah, I think that these comments are really powerful, because I think that really what they say in toto is that bringing voices of other scientists, social scientists, into play in influential ways, in the ways that we do our work and think about moving it forward, is going to be an essential element of the kind of culture change that we're thinking about here. And if all of us representing these very different sectors of the community at large, the ecosystem, can have that in mind and really attach value to bringing those other voices into play, I think we can really begin to move on this really difficult challenge of culture change, and I think that'll be an important thing for all of us to kind of take home into our own environments as we try to move forward. Other questions or comments from the panel? But other questions? Yeah, Chris, go ahead.
What Victor said, because when I was at GSK, I brought the two ends of Tobacco Road together with Duke and UNC, where we funded a program to actually help educate physicians on generic drugs, because doctors graduating today have never heard of atorvastatin, and there are no reps out there going about it. So we actually found that this was a program to actually be able to educate physicians on affordable medicines and make sure they understand when and where they should be operated. But that's just sort of some of the things that we could be doing.
Now, just to make a comment on social science, which I'm really glad Victor brought up, is something that is impacting every area of technology. The fact that we don't have a full understanding of how to implement technologies effectively, how to reach communities that are important to reach, is something that we can solve if we work together with social scientists, economists, and others, behavioral scientists who understand how to implement technologies. And I think if we're able to engage with them earlier on in the process of developing our own science, it informs the approach that we choose to pursue in our work, even if it's early stage research. And I will say that PCAST, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, we have a working group that is focused on social science and its impact on exactly what we're talking about, the ability to translate science effectively. So forming those partnerships is really important across universities, across other community centers and so forth. I also think it's important to form partnerships of other kinds, and that includes being able to have some reach from a university perspective, being able to form connections with community colleges and technical colleges and universities that have a focus on other areas such as the social sciences, all help to expand the reach of our technology and to inform it. And it also brings us closer to those who are impacted by those technologies, to answer a little bit of the other end of that first or original question that led to this discussion.
I think I just saw that fentanyl overdose deaths are threatening to displace cardiovascular as a major cause of death. And if you try to think about the social forces and determinants that come into play that are leading to these fentanyl deaths, I think it underscores the importance of bringing the social sciences in very, very influential ways into all the ways that we're thinking about the way that we do our work. So, really critical. Santa?
Bringing it back to kind of what we've all read before today's session, and that is looking at the report and looking at new technologies and having to not only regulate them, but consider how to use them in a proper way for social ends, in a way that is different from how we've dealt with previous technologies or platforms. I think that's a general problem. You know, we've talked about the innovation ecosystem. We've talked about tech transfer offices. We've talked about lack of diversity in the professoriate. We've talked about the fact that we didn't talk about this, but the fact that if you look at admissions, for example, in the health sciences, that we're still not doing very well, as Holden said. And there are things we can do in introducing things like holistic admissions. But, you know, for us to really move the needle, there needs to be sort of an overarching plan. And it seems like it's a general problem. You know, whether you're thinking about chips for science or what we need to do to be competitive globally in terms of semiconductors, if you look at the numbers, we're looking at it in a fragmented way. We're looking at it by regions. It really needs to be a national plan to actually reach the targets so we can actually produce the talent needed for us to remain globally competitive. So the same thing occurs here. We've touched upon fragments of what we need to ensure that there's equity in health innovation. But, and I think that's probably what this is all about, and Victor's probably going to sum it up, right, is to put it all in one place and put forth sort of a master or national plan that we can all embrace moving forward. So I think that's why I'm so excited to be here.
Other questions from the audience?
Hello, Andrew Boyd from University of Illinois at Chicago. I want to bring together a few of the themes that the panelists talked about. Holden talked about how a single PI talked to their graduate student about public policy and like discourage that for future success. We've talked about the success of slow science and the publication, both messenger RNA as well as the microparticles, being in second-tier journals or not in not science.
Immunity is a great journal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
It's not mine, but it's still excellent.
Okay, sorry. Not in science. But the question ultimately is in the labs, across the ecosystems, how do we take these strange ideas and how many national challenges are we having these ideas snipped in the bud and encourage the culture of these non-traditional career paths or non-traditional science directions and encourage that from the undergraduate, graduate level, and the cultural equity and the diversity of science ideas and nurturing them to grow up amongst them all.
So I'm not going to answer your question except to say that the students that we have these days are very open to a very different culture, and they're much more willing to express their views on it than they were back when I was a student. So I think the opportunity is there. There's a very fertile field for it.
Yeah, and we need to stop saying non-traditional, because the academic appointment is the non-traditional appointment. If you look at the numbers, there are far more students going into everything else. And so as soon as we stop saying alternative careers and non-traditional careers and start saying we're here to help our students achieve their goals, not our goals. I mean, when you think about it, you know, most of these universities have some slogan like, you know, study here, go anywhere, all right? But for graduate school, it's really study here, go where we tell you. You know, and if the administrations and the leadership would start enforcing the fact that graduate school should be where you go to get training so that you can then do what you want, which, you know, Pete Townsend tried to tell us when he wrote Tommy, right? That the students should decide what they want to do, not their PIs, then, you know, that's the crux of this whole problem.
Relevant to what Holden just said, last Friday I just finished teaching a science policy course at UCSF for graduate students. It's almost all first-year students who elect, it's not required, who elect to take this course. And during the course of the course, they need to develop a policy brief and a letter to the editor, and it's, you know, about science or science policy. And it's just remarkable that almost to a person, the pieces that they developed had to do with how the science could and should be affecting society at large. They weren't at saying, you know, more money for my molecular biology research. It was quite striking. And so what Holden said is right. Actually, the students do know what they want to do. And we're squashing that. And so I think that we just need to just be aware of that and try to respond to it as we go back to our home turf. I'm conscious of the time, and I wanted to just thank, take a second, and thank everybody on this panel for their comments and you for yours.